My father, David, a man whose laughter always sounded like a business transaction, had his head thrown back in delight. A champagne flute was halfway to his lips, capturing the warm glow of the fireplace. The room behind him was a perfect picture of Christmas cheer, filled with the smiling, oblivious faces of my family. They were all so warm, so comfortable, completely unaware of the cold, hard reality I held in my arms. My grandmother Eleanor's body was trembling violently against mine, her thin slippers soaked through with melted snow. I met my father's eyes across the room, and the laughter died in his throat as the entire party fell silent. Her accounts are frozen, effective now. Just an hour before, I had pulled up to that same house, the tires of my car crunching on the pristine snow. The windows glowed with a welcoming light, and I could hear the faint, muffled sound of music and joy from within. For a moment, I almost let myself believe in the illusion of a happy family gathering. I almost let the warmth fool me. But then I saw her, a small, hunched figure on the dark porch, barely visible against the siding. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, shot through me. It was my grandmother, locked out, shivering in nothing but a thin nightgown. I was out of the car in a second, my own coat wrapped around her frail shoulders before I even registered the rage building in my chest. This wasn't just forgetfulness. It wasn't another one of their casual oversights, like the missed doctor's appointments, or the unanswered phone calls I was always left to follow up on. This was something else entirely, the quiet, cruel consequence of their greed. They were happy to let her fade into the background, to become an inconvenience they could simply shut the door on, all while her confusion served their bottom line. As I lifted her into my arms, she weighed almost nothing. The sound of their laughter from inside felt like a physical blow. They were in there, drinking her expensive wine, warming themselves by her fire, all while she was freezing just a few feet away. Every condescending remark about my boring job, every dismissive wave of the hand when I brought up my concerns for her care. It all clicked into place. They didn't just see her as old, they saw her as an obstacle. A final, frustrating line item on a balance sheet they were desperate to cash out. The horrifying realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. They weren't just neglectful, they were predators waiting for the weakest moment. They thought I was just the quiet daughter with a boring desk job. They had no idea that my entire career was dedicated to hunting people exactly like them. To understand the authority in my voice, you have to understand the two lives I was living. To my family, I was a known quantity, reliable, quiet, and utterly unremarkable. They saw my life as a series of spreadsheets and tax forms, a stable but painfully boring government job that was a safe, uninspired second place to the dazzling trajectory of my brother. They had constructed this narrative for me, and for the sake of a fragile peace, I let them believe it. The truth, however, was a carefully guarded secret. My real life was a world away from their condescending assumptions, a place of immense responsibility where my quiet observations had the weight of federal law. I remember a family meeting 3 months before that Christmas Eve, held around my grandmother Eleanor's polished dining room table. It was a suffocating affair. My father, David, led the discussion with the forced solemnity of a man doing something noble that was also conveniently in his own best interest. Sitting beside him was my mother, Susan, a woman who believed family harmony was a garden that grew best when fertilized with polite fictions. And across from me sat my brother, Mark, the family's golden boy, who wore his charisma like a shield, deflecting any suggestion that his financial instincts were anything but genius. They were discussing Eleanor's finances, using soft, pillowy words like simplifying and consolidating to describe what I recognized as a hostile takeover of her life savings. Mark, fresh off some online trading seminar, started talking about aggressive growth funds. He used a lot of buzzwords: alpha, market disruption, leveraging, assets. And my father nodded along, his face beaming with pride. I saw it then, the familiar montage of a lifetime of dismissals. I saw the science fair project I'd worked on for months, being ignored for Mark's participation trophy, the academic scholarship. I won, being celebrated with a quiet dinner, while his promotion to junior sales associate got a catered party. This was just another entry in that long, invisible ledger. I tried to intervene. I cleared my throat and spoke in a calm, measured tone about setting up an irrevocable trust, ensuring that a professional third party would manage her funds specifically for her long-term medical and personal care. It was the safest, most logical option. My father let me finish, a patient, weary smile on his face. Then he reached across the table and patted my head, a gesture of such profound condescension it sucked the air from my lungs. "Leave the numbers to the big boys, sweetie," he said, his voice dripping with false affection. "You stick to your books." My brother snickered. They had a nickname for me for moments like this, Saint Ava the bookkeeper. While they were laughing at that nickname, my actual workday looked very different. My office wasn't a cubicle. It was a secure, soundproofed briefing room, a place where phones were forbidden and the air hummed with the quiet intensity of federal oversight. I wasn't just a bookkeeper. I was a senior forensic auditor for the Treasury Department's Elder Justice Initiative. That same week, I was tracking the movements of a predator who had siphoned over $2 million from a dozen retirees in Florida. I was the one who found the pattern he thought was so clever. I remember explaining it to my team. The subject initiated a series of structured withdrawals below the currency transaction. "Report threshold," I said, pointing to a complex flowchart on the screen. "This pattern indicates a clear attempt to circumvent federal oversight." He was hiding in plain sight. My superior, Director Evans, a sharp, no-nonsense man who saw data, as a language and respected me for my fluency, listened intently. He didn't pat me on the head. He didn't call me sweetie. He looked at my analysis, then at me, and gave a single decisive nod. Later that day, he stopped by my desk, a signed court order in his hand. "Your affidavit just secured the emergency asset freeze," he told me, his voice low and serious. "You saved that man's entire life savings, Ava. Good work." In his world, my name wasn't a joke. It was the signature at the bottom of a document that could stop a crime in its tracks. The validation was so profound, so starkly different from my family's world, that it almost felt like it was happening to someone else. Living those two lives was exhausting. In one reality, I was Saint Ava, the naive bookkeeper whose concerns were cute but ultimately irrelevant. I was expected to shrink myself, to nod and smile while my intelligence was openly mocked. In the other reality, my analysis was trusted by federal agents. My signature could financially paralyze sophisticated criminals. I was a protector, an authority, a silent force ensuring justice for the most vulnerable. I had to code switch so violently between the two that some days I felt like a stranger to myself. The person they saw, and the person I allowed them to see, was a ghost, a pale, simplified version of the woman who spent her days hunting monsters. For years, I kept my worlds separate. I let them believe their narrative because it was easier than fighting. But when I saw my grandmother shivering in the cold, I realized the wall between my worlds had to come down. They only respected power and money. So I decided I would finally speak to them in the only language they understood. As I settled my grandmother into the passenger seat, the car's heater, blasting warm air over her icy skin, something inside me shifted. The hot, blinding rage I felt just moments before began to cool, solidifying into something hard, sharp, and precise. An emotional screaming match would accomplish nothing. They would just dismiss me as hysterical, another outburst from Saint Ava. No, their language wasn't emotion. It was power, and I was about to speak it fluently. My mind, trained by years of professional practice, compartmentalized the hurt and focused on the objective, not revenge, but asset protection and fiduciary intervention. I reached into my bag and pulled out my encrypted work laptop. For months, I had been building a quiet, sealed case file, a contingency I prayed I would never need. Opening it felt like breaking a seal on a darker reality I had long tried to ignore. There it was, the durable power of attorney my grandmother had signed 6 months ago, her hand steady, her eyes clear. "Just in case, my dear," she had said, trusting me completely. That trust was a sacred duty, and I was not going to fail her. Next, I pulled up the neurologist's report I had commissioned, the one that documented her early-stage dementia, and officially flagged her as a vulnerable person, susceptible to exactly this kind of coercion. The final piece was the bank records. I had been monitoring them for a year, watching as my father, David, made a series of small, regular gifts to himself from her accounts. He must have thought the amounts were insignificant enough to go unnoticed, just minor perks of being the son in charge. He had no idea the family bookkeeper was also a forensic auditor, trained to see the story. That small, insignificant numbers tell, a story of escalating greed and entitlement. The digital paper trail was undeniable, a perfect chronicle of his intentions. With all the evidence aligned, I made one final, encrypted call. My voice was steady as I spoke to my boss, Director Evans. I didn't say my dad was being a monster or that I was falling apart. I used the language of my profession. Director, I said calmly, I have a developing situation of active elder exploitation involving a vulnerable family member. There was no hesitation on his end, only immediate trust. I'm authorizing an emergency fiduciary override, effective immediately, he responded, his voice a firm line of support. Lock down all assets. We'll file the formal report on the 26th. The system protects its own, Ava. Handle it. The party was in full swing. My father was toasting his future, funded by my grandmother's past. He had no idea I had just built a legal and financial fortress around her in less than 10 minutes. He was about to learn that my boring desk job came with a federal mandate. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the warm, festive room, and it was like plunging the scene into ice water. The music faltered and died. The cheerful chatter evaporated into confused murmurs. Every head turned towards me, their expressions shifting from holiday cheer to pure annoyance. I was an unwelcome interruption, a discordant note in their perfect Christmas Eve symphony. My father, David, turned his back on the guest he was charming, his face a mask of irritation. There you are, he snapped, his voice a low growl meant only for me. Stop making a scene and put Mother to bed. You're ruining the mood. I could feel the collective agreement ripple through the room. The disapproving aunts, the complicit, uncles, all of them siding with him, eager for the unpleasantness in the doorway to simply disappear. I ignored him. I ignored them all. My focus was singular, absolute. With deliberate, careful movements, I walked past the stunned crowd and over to the large armchair by the fireplace, the one that had always been my grandmother's favorite. I gently lowered her into its plush cushions, unwrapping my own coat from her shoulders and pulling a soft afghan over her. I tucked it in around her, making sure she was warm and secure. This quiet, tender act was my true first statement of the night. It was a silent declaration. She is the one who matters here. She is the center of this world, not your party. Only when I was certain she was comfortable did I finally straighten up and turn to face the room. To face my father. My voice was level, devoid of the fury that was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It was the voice I used at work to state incontrovertible facts. She was locked outside. My father let out a short, scoffing laugh. Don't be dramatic, Ava, he said, waving a dismissive hand. She probably just wandered off. You know how she gets. The familiar accusation hung in the air. That I was dramatic, that I was hysterical, that my concerns were just noise. It was the same tone he'd used my entire life to invalidate any feeling that was inconvenient to him. I looked at him, and all I could see was a lifetime of being told my reality wasn't real. It doesn't matter, I said, and my voice dropped, cutting through. The silence with a new and unfamiliar weight that made him pause. What matters is that this ends now. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, its screen glowing in the dim light. My father's smirk widened. He thought he knew what was coming next, some pathetic, emotional plea. I let him have that final moment of ignorant bliss before I delivered. The 6 words that would bring his world crashing down around him. Her accounts are frozen, effective now. For a second, there was only stunned silence. Then, my father threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming, arrogant sound, meant to assure the room that he was still in control. What are you talking about? He chuckled, looking around for support. Playing with your little spreadsheets again, sweetie? Did you call the bank's little 1-800 number and they put you on hold? My brother Mark snickered beside him, the perfect echo of his father's condescension. No, I said calmly. The single word sliced through his laughter and killed it instantly. I held my phone up, not for him but for the entire room to see. I'm a senior forensic auditor with the United States Treasury. I let the title hang in the air, each word landing like a stone. As per my authority under the Elder Justice Initiative, and as the sole signatory on Eleanor's durable power of attorney, I have placed a temporary federal hold on all assets pending a formal investigation into suspected fiduciary misconduct and elder endangerment. I turned the screen so he could see the official email, the one with the Treasury Department's eagle seal at the top. The proof. The change was instantaneous and devastating. The blood drained from my father's face, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask of disbelief and horror. The laugh lines around his eyes seemed to instantly deepen into fissures of pure panic. My mother, Susan, let out a choked gasp, her hand flying to her throat as her carefully constructed world of polite appearances shattered into a million pieces. And Mark, the family's financial genius, looked like he was going to be physically ill. The smug confidence melted off his face, replaced by the sickly green pallor of someone who understood. Perhaps even better than my father, the catastrophic implications of a federal investigation. The party was over. The room was no longer a celebration. It was the scene of a public execution, and my family was the one on the scaffold. My father had spent his life believing he held all the power. In the end, it only took my real job title to take it all away. The silence that fell over the room was nothing like the quiet of peace. It was a dense, heavy vacuum, suffocating the festive decorations and glittering lights. The guests, who moments before had been laughing and celebrating, were now frozen, statues, their eyes darting between my family's horrified faces and me. They were witnesses to something raw and real, a private rot that had just been exposed to the air, and they wanted nothing more than to escape. But no one moved. No one dared to breathe. The implosion was so total, so absolute, that it held us all captive in its gravitational pull. In the center of that wreckage, I felt a profound and unnerving calm. I made one more call, my voice steady, my movements efficient. The woman on the other end was from the 24/7's private care service I had placed on standby weeks ago. She was professional, compassionate, and understanding. Within 30 minutes, a caregiver named Maria arrived, a kind, competent woman who immediately went to my grandmother's side, speaking to her in a soft, reassuring tone. While Maria tended to Eleanor, I went upstairs to my grandmother's room and calmly packed a bag with her essentials, her favorite worn cardigan, her reading glasses, and the small framed photo of my grandfather she kept on her nightstand. The whole process was methodical, a series of necessary steps. As Maria and I helped Eleanor to the front door, my father finally broke from his stupor. A flicker of his old blustering rage returned. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice cracking. "This is my house. My mother." He still didn't understand. He wasn't seeing his mother, a person who needed care. He was seeing a possession, an asset, being removed from his control. I paused at the threshold, the cold night air on my face, and looked back at him. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with a deep, weary pity. "It was never about you," I said softly. Then I closed the door on him, on them, and on the entire life I was leaving behind in the ruins of their ruined party. That night, I didn't just walk out of a house. I walked out of the story they had written for me. A year later, I was writing my own. My new apartment was filled with light, a sanctuary of calm overlooking the city. My grandmother, Eleanor, was safe and content there with me. She would spend her afternoons by the sunny window, looking through old photo albums, her memory clearer and her spirit lighter than it had been in years. On my office wall hung a framed commendation from the Secretary of the Treasury, a quiet acknowledgement of a complex case I had successfully closed. I was no longer just a senior auditor. I was leading my own investigative unit, my name on the door. I had built a new life, not on the ashes of the old one, but on a foundation of my own making. My new family was one of choice, not obligation. I remember having lunch with Director Evans, who had become a true mentor. The conversation wasn't just about work anymore. It was about life. "The investigation confirmed everything you suspected, Ava," he said, stirring his coffee. "The paper trail was undeniable. But you should know," he added, looking me directly in the eye, "you didn't just save your grandmother. You upheld the oath we all took." His words were a balm, a final official validation that my actions were not just personal but righteous. This was a family built on a shared mission, on mutual respect, a bond stronger than any dysfunctional blood tie. One afternoon, while reviewing a complex case file at my desk, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from my brother, Mark. I hadn't heard from any of them in a year. I read the words and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a distant clinical sense of finality. "Dad's legal fees are burying him," he wrote. "Mom is a wreck. They're going to lose the house. Can we talk?" There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused. It was just a problem, a balance sheet that was in the red, and they were turning to the family bookkeeper to fix it one last time. I looked at the message, a final, pathetic plea from a world I no longer inhabited. I took a deep breath. archived the conversation without a reply, and turned my full attention back to the important work in front of me. My family thought a legacy was something you could take. I learned that a true legacy is the safety you build for the people you love. If you've ever had to become the protector when no one else would, share your story below. In this community, your quiet strength is always seen.